Chris Robertshaw MHK joins me in the studio. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So I'd like to ask you, first of all, you have said previously you're a big fan of the government's decision in this instance. You said you were very proud to witness the announcement of the buying out of the steam packet in Tynwald. But how does government's buying of the steam packet fit with your view of a smaller government, first of all?
Well, it certainly does, but let me just say that I waited 24 years for the steam packet to come into national ownership, and I was beginning to think I'd never see the day, so it was absolutely marvellous. Your question. The steam packet is not a department of government. I mean, it's separate, and really that whole point about where the steam packet sits in relation to government is the current discussion and debate, and really is the root of why I took the position that I did in Tynwald last week, because although I'm absolutely for what's happening, we were all of us, when the decision was made, very cognizant of the fact that actually we had to be careful about how the relationship with government and the steam packet worked. And sadly, I think that under the terms of the Sea Service Agreement, the two departments of government, Department for Infrastructure and Department for Enterprise, have rushed their fences. Right from the get-go, it was understood as far back as May last year that Tynwald would sign off the full Sea Service Agreement. And then even in the submission to Tynwald last week, the Department for Enterprise were using words equivalent to the full Sea Service Agreement will be signed off by Tynwald. What we actually got was something else, which was something called Heads of Terms, which is the broad base of where things are going. And when members had this Heads of Terms, this skeletal arrangement presented, we were told at that time, much to my surprise, that the Department of Infrastructure had already signed it off, and it was just a question of Tynwald rubber stamping it. So my question at that presentation, this is not in Tynwald, this is a little time before, I said, yes, but we will surely be signing off the full Sea Service Agreement. And there was a shuffling of papers and various postures indicated that wasn't to be the case. And sure enough, it wasn't the case. There is no desire on the part of Council of Ministers to have Tynwald sign off the Sea Service Agreement. Now, this is a huge opportunity missed, because it's going to be very important as we go forward that there isn't constant political interference with the arrangements between government and therefore the people and the steam packet. And therefore it's very, very important to get all the details right at this stage. So to be presented with a situation where we're just asked to sign off the broad base of it is, well, it's foolish and short-sighted. I asked the question, look, if the heads of terms are going to be the same as the full agreement in detail, then what's the problem? Why won't you sign it off? Conversely, if there are going to be differences between the heads of terms and the full agreement, then surely Tynwald should be signing it off. To this day, I haven't had an answer to that, and I am really concerned that they're rushing the fences in a number of ways. For example, in the submissions to Tynwald last week, the Department for Enterprise said that they hadn't actually done a deep economic impact study of various options that might be in front of us in a variety of areas, commercial areas. And the reason they gave, which was quite extraordinary and hard to believe really, they said that they hadn't done it because they hadn't had time to do it. Now that indicates that they wanted to do it, but they hadn't actually done it. It beggars belief when you consider that we're actually signing off a Sea Service Agreement for 25 years, albeit that there are breaks in it, 5-year breaks. The fact that we're signing something off now for 25 years with a background where the departments haven't done their homework is just breathtaking, frankly.
But why has it been presented to Tynwald in this in this manner? Is it because of time constraints? Do you feel is that the reason?
There are no time constraints. Of course, it's important that we press the button as soon as possible on a new boat. I mean, everybody accepts that as read. But if you wanted to take more time to do a long-term agreement, you could do an interim arrangement which would give sufficient comfort to make sure that the investment in the boat was appropriate. So, no, there is no time problem. They're making that up because they just want to rush things through. Unfortunately, and I've said this many times in a variety of different arenas, but this is another example of government failing to understand that it has to deal with issues operationally and strategically. And yet again, there's been a failure on the Department for Enterprise to deal with things in a full strategic sense. I understand why it's happened. I mean, they're working very hard on an operational level, but they haven't got the time or, frankly, the competence to deal with things strategically. And yet, both ministers, both Ray Harmer and Lord Skelly, both signed up to it, and therefore all 8 members from those 2 departments had to, as it were, join the Council of Ministers and sign it up. So that's why my proposal was so heavily defeated. It just was a question of trying to shunt something through Tynwald, and I think that's unforgivable considering the huge importance of this matter. It's interesting, isn't it, that the 2 big defining things that you can identify so far with this administration, that's the Sir Jonathan Michael's health report and the purchase of the steam packet, both of those key important decisions are being either, in broad terms, handled well or in the process of being handled well, and both were done outside of individual departments. But as soon as you give individual departments the responsibility to deliver, in this case we're talking about the Sea Service Agreement and DOI, you get failure.
I can't help but just quickly jump back on something you said before. You said that this was a decision which you'd been looking forward to for
yes.
I think you said 24 years.
24 years. Embarrassing but true.
Is it something that's been considered before?
No. Originally, I was almost a lone voice in those days, saying, for goodness sake, don't do what you're going to do, because you're going to effectively make the steam packet effectively something that can be bought and sold on the international financial markets, which is exactly what's happened, which is where the debt came from. So I was against the principle at that stage, and well, in fact, long history has sort of proved that point to be true and correct.
And just for context, you tabled an amendment this week, which ultimately was unsuccessful. But as I say, for context, could you maybe just tell us a bit about what your hopes were in doing that?
Yes, I just simply said that I agreed absolutely with all the other wording in the proposals. In broad terms, most of the stuff in the heads of terms I'm comfortable with. My amendment simply intended or required the Council of Ministers to do what they said they were going to do last May, and what the Department for Enterprise said in their submissions, that the full agreement would come to Tynwald and be considered. When you're in business, the last thing you would do would be not to look at the detail of a very, very important contract. And that's what is happening to Tynwald. Frankly, Tynwald has been treated, well, the members have been treated like children, and it's quite disgraceful. But the point is this, that if we really do want to have a proper settlement between the people and government and the steam packet, then it has to be done on the basis of an open and transparent arrangement and full detail. For example, last week in the Examiner, was it, the various retail organisations came out and said we need a new settlement point, a start point for freight rates. And I absolutely agree with that. That hasn't happened at all. Now, if we were approaching this properly, part of the submission to Tynwald would not just be the detail of the Sea Service Agreement, but it would also be a report to show that A, the steam packet were going to get sufficient returns to invest in new boats, and 2, that government was getting a decent return on investment, but no more than a decent return in both cases. problem is we're blind to that. So various commercial entities don't know whether they're getting the best possible deal that they can. And so, as it were, the private sector has been kept in the dark now by government, and that really sort of won't do. But if there is a new set point for freight rates, which gives comfort to the investments necessary in both steam packet and government, then the private sector can then be a lot more comfortable and accept the fact that what they're getting is a fair deal. Right now they don't know, they're suspicious. There's every reason to think that they're not being treated fairly, because if you scroll back to the last time there was a competitive proposition came forward and a lot of turbulence occurred, if you might recall that at that time the 5 biggest haulage companies were given special discount rates. Now, my understanding, right or wrong, and I could be out a few percentage points, is that those 5 big haulage companies represent 80% of the freight traffic which is going through the ferry, through our ferry service. And that we're also given to understand, because we haven't seen the details and we haven't seen the accounts, that it's freight that makes the money. So the point is this, that if it is the case that 80% of the freight traffic going through the steam packet company was offered a discount rate, and yet the company was still making 12 to 15 million, then it's reasonable to argue that the freight rates that they were charging prior to that were too high. What the private sector now want to know is, let's make sure that we get a fair set of rates, and it's whether it's one of the top 5 hauliers or the other smaller companies that are operating through the freight service.
Bringing the steam packet into public ownership allows for that sort of, what would you say, scrutiny from private firms, and it allows for lobbying processes perhaps which wouldn't be available when it was under private ownership. Would that be fair?
That's absolutely correct, and it's something that we need to take account of, and that's why it's important now to get a fair settlement between all parties that we're all going to genuinely sign up to, and that's not happening. Let me just take you back to one particular issue which relates to your point about it's now owned by government. Back to these 5 big hauliers again. As I understand it, they're going to be given a discount rate if they achieve 300,000 lane metres per year per organisation. What I don't know beyond that is whether there's any exclusivity. In other words, if they don't exclusively use the steam packet, then they may well be subject to difficulties there. Now, if it was a private sector operator, you might argue that that private sector company could deal in that manner, but government can't, because at the same time as it's trying to set up its arrangement with the steam packet, we're also slowly developing a competition bill. Now, that competition bill would actually define what the old steam packet did in relation to exclusivity as illegal. Now, government cannot act illegally. It must act above board and in a transparent way. The fact that the DOI and Department for Enterprise are trying to sort of smuggle this arrangement through and trying to keep members at arm's length is very, very short-sighted and very, very foolish. Let's get all the cards on the table. Let's get the settlements we need, and then we can all quietly get on confidently with all our various roles. Right now, while you've got that attitude that the departments of government and the steam packet are not showing their cards, then you will not get buy-in from the private sector.
With an investment of this kind from government, if you're a member of the public and maybe somebody who uses the steam packet, whether that be privately or for your company, the fact that that's not debated in full in the court of Tynwald, is that not a bit alarming for democracy, maybe?
Oh, it's very alarming. It's alarming that the Department for Enterprise have approached this, and they're quite blatant about it. They say that the Sea Service Agreement, the baseline for them was to take the old user agreement and make it a bit better. I'm afraid that's just not good enough. And I'm not at all surprised that the elements of the private sector are kicking off already. It should be an enormous warning to the Council of Ministers, to Tynwald, to the steam packet company, that they're not going about this in the right way.
As I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, you've already said you were very proud to see the decision made.
Absolutely.
It's a move you agreed with. Is it at risk of becoming a bit of a political football here with what's happened to this point?
If it becomes a political football, then it falls absolutely, the responsibility falls on the DOI and the Department for Enterprise for not doing their job properly. If you compare the way we bought the steam packet and the professionality that the Treasury managed to achieve with regard to that process, and certainly enjoyed my absolute respect, and then compare it to the way the DOI and Department for Enterprise are behaving, they're miles apart. And Department for Enterprise and DOI, effectively, I was going to say, have got to pull their socks up, but that won't happen, because they are effectively operational organisations trying to do strategic work. The whole Sea Service Agreement should have been handled in a different way. It should have been posted up to the National Strategy Group. They should have brought professionals in to assist in the process and then make it a transparent and open process. It can still happen. It's not really too late. It's just an embarrassing fiasco at the moment.
So is there room for a bit of a U-turn here? Is there room for things still to be discussed, you feel, or is the flag?
Well, I hope so. I mean, DOI brought out what it called the harbour strategy, which frankly is an absolute fiasco. I mean, it's verging on the laughable. And I'm hoping that they're slowly backing off now as they realise what a mess they made of that. Well, they're making a mess now of the Sea Service Agreement, and they need to sort themselves out. But it's not going to happen inside a single department. They haven't got the capacity or the competence to do it. It needs to go up into an NSG, a National Strategy Group, effort, and the right advice and guidance needs to come in. And that issue about the community that now owns the steam packet must understand clearly what the returns on investment are, so that it's clear and supported by everybody.
You've mentioned as well, another thing to pick up on, you mentioned the lack of an economic assessment from the Department for Enterprise. How's it a decision that can be taken without having that in mind?
Well, it can't. I mean, there's all sorts of things in there that make you say, well, goodness me, what's that? I mean, one of the things in the Sea Service Agreement, it says that the government will commit itself to only having 2 link spans. Now, we're talking about a 25-year cycle. It's agreeing with itself that it will only have 2 link spans. It should have nuanced that, because we don't know what's going to happen in the next 25 years. We may very well need 3. So the wording should have been captured in a way that would allow that process to go forward without damaging the arrangements that are signed up with the steam packet. That's not there. There's the issue with regard to the number of discounted fares to the visitor sector, which is utterly ill-defined. I mean, you know the old story about we'll give you 1,000 discounted fares, but they'll be on the midnight boat in February. You know, I mean, that's a bit of an overstatement. All of these things need to be properly defined in a full agreement that we sign off on, and we need to take our time about it.
Earlier in the overtaking process, I've forgotten the word now, Alistair Ramsey, a political commentator, branded the process as a shocking failure of government transparency and parliamentary oversight, and wrote Tynwald was being railroaded in a manner that would once have been unacceptable, adding that it showed a disturbing disregard for the principles of democratic decision-making. Do you feel those sentiments apply this week? Do you agree with that?
I agree with them now. I don't agree with Alistair with regard to the purchase of the steam packet, because it was a very sensitive and difficult issue to deal with, because it wasn't just government, as it were, talking to itself. It was government talking to the international financiers, and therefore there were all sorts of complicated constraints. And I repeat myself, nonetheless, Treasury had the really high quality advice and guidance. Those of us really focused on this considered all that carefully and decided, yes, this is absolutely the right deal. What's wrong this time is that we're rushing our fences with regard to this sea service agreement when we don't need to in the first place. And secondly, we're doing it in an inappropriate way operationally inside the department. And thirdly, we're not taking proper advice. It is an absolute shambles. But coming back to your point about Alistair's point about being railroaded through Tynwald, I have to say that the current Tynwald membership is far too compliant. Political challenge is a very, very important part of the process. I mean, as you probably know, I'm on the policy review side. I'm in all bar one of all the policy review committees, and I'm dedicated to trying to make scrutiny of government constructive and a good part of the process, rather than a yaboo sort of politics approach that may have been the case now and again in the past. What's concerning, really concerning, is that we're getting very few individual members coming to the floor of Tynwald with motions to express their particular views about something, and then when a challenge occurs, people very much fall in line. And one of the reasons that my amendment failed so badly was because, and this was designed to be the case, I have to say, on the part of Council of Ministers, that DOI and Department for Enterprise stood beside Council of Ministers. Well, both departments had 4 members each. So you had absolute guarantee of 18 votes before you even started. Is it any surprise then that government is allowing itself, as it is in this case, to be lackadaisical and clumsy? I mean, I think you've got Ray on afterwards, and you'll hear him breeze these things away as irrelevant. But I would ask your listeners to think about these things very, very carefully. We need constructive, robust challenge that is in place because it wants to see the right thing done, rather than what we've got at the moment, which is just too much nodding stuff through.
If I were to don an especially cynical hat, perhaps on a Sunday,
Yeah.
I might say it appears that Tynwald only applies democracy when it suits. Would that be unfair?
I think the weakness we've got at the moment is that our current Chief Minister is oversensitive and uncomfortable with challenge, and his arrival on the scene coincided with 12 new members who have been trying to find their feet, and so he had a very benign environment to step into, and that's why this sort of thing is happening. I hope by the time we get to the next general election, the current new members will be much more robust in their approach, and that we'll have a Chief Minister then who is much more inclined to recognise the importance of having constructive challenge. It's part of good policy making.
But whatever your views on individuals in this administration, does the sort of current system of parliamentary process allow for that challenge?
No, it doesn't, because what happens, it's designed, it's built in. What's designed at the moment is that when a new member comes in, they're given a delegated authority within a particular department and an extra £10,000. And what happens at that stage is that each member is then moulded into this sense that they've got a particular small responsibility, which will, in their eyes, grow in importance. And they've got extra money to do it. And what happens is politicians start to become interfering managers rather than policymakers at a much higher level. Those on scrutiny get paid absolutely nothing extra. So you can understand that members are disinclined to want to migrate to scrutiny, because there's effectively more money available to them being part of the system. Because once you're in a department, when your minister goes in a particular direction with regard to departmental business, then you have to vote with them. So that's the weakness in our democratic process. What we need to see is a levelling up of the income for a member in a department on the executive side and a scrutiny member, and hopefully then a better balance will be found. I would have thought you'd need about 8 people on scrutiny side in Keys, and most of the rest either the Speaker or in government.
We are veering into a topic which was discussed on a previous programme. To apply that then to this case study, if you like, I suppose the question is, what would you have done differently, succinctly?
Me? I couldn't do anything differently. I mean, all I can just do is keep saying to people, let's rebalance the system.
Well, if you were in Minister Harmer's shoes, then perhaps.
If I was in his shoes, I would have made absolutely sure that the process was migrated up to a strategic level, that we found strategic competence, that it was much more open, transparent, and that it gained the confidence of all the interested parties, all the stakeholders, of which there are many. Right now it hasn't, and because it hasn't, it's going to be, as it were, a bit of a running sore until it's sorted.
And is there a hope that could still happen?
Well, hope travels, keeps travelling, and I hope so, yeah.